Hi everyone, this is Jason, producer of Data and Biotech. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know about our latest white paper. It's a comprehensive guide to implementing machine learning models in biotech manufacturing. It's a complete overview of all the potential problems of ML adoption and, more importantly, how to solve them. To download it, simply visit connect.cordine.com/biotech-ml. We've also dropped the link in the show notes of this episode. Okay, let's get into it. Welcome to Data in Biotech, a podcast from Cordine where we explore how companies leverage data to drive innovation in life sciences. Every 2 weeks, we sit down with an expert from the world of biotechnology to understand how they are using data science to solve technical challenges, streamline operations, and further innovation in their business. This week, we sat down with Guru and Satya Singh, two brothers that founded the biotech software company Scispot. Scispot's infrastructure platform helps biotech companies create their own digital brain and accelerate their R&D process. During the interview, we covered a lot of topics, including how to bridge the gap between wet lab scientists and computational experts in biotech organizations, why the future of biotech is externalized and interconnected with a focus on standardized data models and easy information exchange, and how to enable real-time feedback within biotech that helps companies become smarter with every experiment. Here we go.
Guru and Satya Singh, welcome to the Data and Biotech podcast. Just to get started, and maybe Guru, you can go first. Could you just give us a brief introduction to you and your background and what brought you to this point?
Yeah, I'm a former lab rat, proud lab rat. So work at the bench, but I was always entrepreneur at heart. Satya and I grew up in a very business family. My first startup was when I was like 8-9 years old. I used to sell aluminum waste from my dad's shoe factory. So always very entrepreneurial, not very social, arguably. And when I moved to the US over a decade ago after grad school, I worked for other biotech software companies. And what I realized is there's tool fatigue in the industry. Research is becoming more and more externalized, distributed, wet lab, dry lab, external partners. But most of the tools, software, hardwares don't talk to each other. And the data is not necessarily easily harmonized, aggregated, or usable. So teamed up with Satya, launched Scispot just to fix that problem.
Satya?
My background is all data related. I worked as a product and data head in Expedia, Hotels.com, Discovery Channel, Eurosport players, enjoyed all of them, but I realized I'm basically making people click more, although click more for good reasons like sports or travel to broaden the mind. But coming to biotech, I feel like it's more fulfilling, like big pharma, biotech, and there's more meaningful results you can drive with data rather than just making people to click more, right? I felt like this was something that I could relate to. And plus, Guru and I, we lost our mother in 2011. So we always wanted to do something together in life science and in memory of her. And the drug came too late for her. So 2 years after she passed, the drug was available in the market. So that hit us really hard personally too. But yeah, that's just like a little bit of background from my side.
Yeah, that's a really touching story. What made you decide to focus on Scispot? How did the idea of Scispot come into being?
So observing this industry for almost 15 years now, what I realized is when I was at the bench, the cost to generate data was really expensive. Generate big data from labs were really expensive. And for example, it cost over $10 million to sequence the entire human genome when I was in the lab about 15 years ago. Now it costs a few $100s, right? This is just one example, but the cost to generate big data is going down. At the same time, we are seeing material growth, substantial growth in AI, right? AI has been democratized to some extent, and I don't know where we'll be in 5 years. The marriage between this organic intelligence, which is bio, that generates tons of big data, and inorganic intelligence, which is artificial intelligence, I think they made up for each other. They're very strong partners in a way because one intelligence generate a lot of data now relatively inexpensively. And then other piece AI can analyze that data, make sense out of it. So we think that if we want to make the biggest impact to accelerate R&D, the best thing we can do is we can turn these bio entities with too many variable, tons of big data, and help them become AI ready. right? So they can learn from their data and accelerate their speed and hopefully bring drugs to market 2 years faster, 3 years faster. I don't know, maybe 10 years faster. Within a few months, we will start seeing new drugs in the market. Obviously, this is wishful thinking, but that's our hope.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So how is Scispot structured in order to solve these particular problems of bringing the organic intelligence and inorganic intelligence together in that optimal feedback loop?
That's a very good point. So when I look at bio company, I feel like they all in the future will have their own digital brain. And this digital brain will, just like when you have a baby with a limited number of synapses, neurons, right? But with more exposure, the brain become enriched, and especially it's more plastic when it's an early stage. That's why we focused on these baby stage or startup stage bio companies, because their brain is still evolving. It's very plastic. They are creating new nodes, new synapses, right? And we see every bio company will have their digital brain that will learn from every experiment they run, every protocol deviation they make, every inventory item they use, every results they generate, every data transformation they do. So we provide data infrastructure that vectorizes the data, create graph database for every company. It's a new generation of lab solution because we think ELN LIMS are decade-old approach. This is a more data science focused platform to help you create your digital brain and become smarter as you grow. So data is your primary asset. Drug candidates and everything is also valuable, but data is your primary asset.
Maybe it would just be useful to break down the Scispot platform into the components of it that help to create that world that you're talking about, where companies are learning from every experiment that they run and every transformation that they do, and you're creating that knowledge graph, that knowledge base that companies can work from.
So heart of the product is data lake, which has built-in connectors, even complementary or competing systems. On top of that, we have apps, alternative to ELN, alternative to LIMS, alternative to SDMS, focused on data science, API first apps that connects on top of it. So when we go to smaller companies, they use a data infrastructure. They need ELN for experiment design and execution. But every experiment has data model behind it, meaning you can directly open the knowledge graph per protocol, per experiment, and see all the nodes connected, right? What materials you use, what protocol steps you ran, results file, everything is connected in a graph database. Similarly, we have instrument connectors, so you can programmatically bring data from other apps, instrument, send it back to your own cloud storage. So again, heart of the product is data lake. On top of that, we have multiple apps, which is optional. You can use Scispot native apps, or you can keep using your own ELN and LIMS. Satya, would you add anything?
Yeah, I think one key differentiator in the market is, so I come from a travel data background where the margins are so low that everything's open. Like you have an API that you collaborate between Trivago and TripAdvisor, or hotels.com says, hey, I'm going to focus on business travelers and I'll let my competitor focus on family travelers. I'll just take commission on the referral that I make through this data or through this API. And I feel like biotech is probably like a decade behind. I think we're coming much closer now, and I'm seeing a lot of progress in startups. So our philosophy right from the beginning was, hey, we don't want to be another Microsoft for bio or one source of truth for bio. We don't want to, without naming any competitors, we don't want to like be where, hey, put everything here, right? We want to be this middleware where we're agnostic to what tools you use. You might have a tool fatigue. You don't want another source of truth, if you will. So with that philosophy in mind, it has really helped us differentiate, hey, you want to use Scispot ELN? Great. Use LIMS that you've built in-house, right? You want to use Scispot integration because you've already invested millions of dollars in your current ELN? Okay, that's fine too. Here's the kind of pipeline that helps you transform that data into a graph database. So that's been our philosophy right from the beginning, and it has drove good results. Obviously, it's been challenging to build all of that. So we've spent a lot of time like building this infrastructure, and we're continuously like adding more features to it. But that's been our mindset in terms of our product roadmap.
I saw on your website that you have like alt ELN, alt LIMS, that you're positioning yourself of being able to take on the capabilities of all of these traditional systems, but do it in a way that is data first, API first. It's like embodying these modern software principles and data principles that we would imagine organizations would want to use. What kind of pushback or cultural barriers are you encountering when you try to sell it, when you try to sell into the market for in scientific disciplines where people might be used to the tools they're used to using, or maybe not as apt to try to do things a different way?
If we can make them use the system, experience the system, there is instant aha moment. But at the time of selling, it becomes a challenge because especially individual scientists are not necessarily thinking about future-proofing their company, right? Making their company AI first. They're thinking about, I prepare multi-well plates, and then I manually send this to instrument, and I have my calculations set up in Excel. It's working for me, and if I can do this in ELN, that's what I need. But that's a very short-sighted approach. And it's very hard to convince them. We need to do a better job, really articulate like why you want to use API first, data science focused system. So that's our biggest challenge. It's more educational in a way, but as soon as we give the product in the hands of customer, there are no questions.
And I think where it helps most is like having a bit of diversity in the team. So it's almost like I'm learning scientists sometimes speak orthogonal languages depending on what background they come from, which is like in every industry, right? But I'm applying my principles from different industries into biotech. So I can see a lot of patterns. And one of the things is like, how do you align wet lab and computational folks into that Venn diagram? Or how do you make sure that their principles are not orthogonal? Or even if it's orthogonal, it's different tooling that can integrate into some sort of like similar patterns. So those are the things that I've learned over the years working with these organizations.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You talked about the aha moment that people have when they get into the platform. Can you just help me understand what that aha moment looks like? What is it about Scispot that gives people that feeling like this is the way it's supposed to be? This is how I want to be doing my biological data science workflows or just my biological data integration type stuff?
Yeah, the biggest aha moment is Scispot Glue, meaning you can connect with all of your internal system. We leverage AI to transform your data, automatically create your data model. So first aha moment is to standardize your data model. If you're a lab-grown meat company, or if you're organ-on-chip company, or you're doing some proteomics workflow, your data model is slightly different or significantly different. We have that learning. So you connect with all the data sources you have. We design your data model, number one. Number two, aha moment I would say is when you connect all of your instruments with Scispot, because we have built in not just extraction layer, but transformation layer, analytics layer. So you don't have to manually receive these CSV spreadsheet, upload it somewhere, set up your formulas, or send it to your bioinformatics team to do the work for you. It's last decade flow, right? So we want to change that. So that's another aha moment, I would say. We try to make it as instant as possible. There are long-term aha moments, right? When you start, most companies, at least now, I think in the future it will change, start working on their AI strategy after a year or two, most cases after Series A. Some companies start as AI first, but most companies prioritize it after Series A or later stage. So if they're using the platform, because we are already cleaning it up, vectorizing it, storing it in graph database, labeling and classify the data leveraging AI, they can train their own models, right? So that's really an aha moment. They don't realize they were sitting on top of this gold mine. Now they can leverage it. More they use the system, smarter their company become in a way.
Interesting. One of the things that I've heard, I think from looking at your website and from the conversations that you had, is that yes, you're creating the explicit data model for companies based on the systems that they're doing, but you're also doing this sort of knowledge graph work where you're doing implicit data analysis or entity extraction and relationship building. You mentioned graph databases just a little bit ago. Can you give us some insight into what that process looks like from Scispot's angle, and then also what value that brings that wouldn't otherwise be there?
Yeah, I think it's implicit, but there's also human in the loop because there's a lot of things that human wants to tag in terms of the accuracy. But to answer your question, when the user comes in, let's say they start using Scispot, all the LN and alt limbs, and they already have a lot of experiments designed and executed, and now they have samples and inventory associated with it. Now their lab ops manager or somebody from the lab comes in and says, hey, I want to see the chain of custody for this particular sample. right? That's where they can go to knowledge graph, see the complete chain of custody. You say, oh, this sample was actually created 5 days ago. And then I actually use this across these 3 methods or protocols for this particular experiment by this user. But in this knowledge graph, how the implicit tagging is done, it hasn't captured how much inventory is left, or how much I need to order more, or is this experiment being successful? So we take those inputs from the human. So although there is implicit tagging of chain of custody, there's human who can provide that feedback as well. So we're continuously like helping the customer optimize that knowledge graph as well. And this knowledge graph can apply it in two sense. One is on your structured data and on your unstructured data as well, because a lot of things that scientists capture is very unstructured, right? So your data doesn't need to be like structured, if you will. What we do in the backend is obviously we create embeddings, and there's a lot of function calling and store this data in a vector database that helps us achieve this feedback loop, if you will, from having human in the loop.
Can you just give me an example of what does that look like from the perspective of the user when you have some like data in unstructured format and there's insights that are getting parsed out of it that without me having to tag it, I can like gain the insight that I wouldn't otherwise have?
Yeah, it's basically like within our last spaces is the alt-DLN. It's in Scispot internal word. You can do / to embed different elements from like your chemistry, mol bio, protocols, your actual database. You can embed things in this notebook. And as you're embedding this, it is automatically contextualizing all of that data behind the scenes, implicitly tagging it and understanding what this is used for and how is this being used.
Even when you're doing note taking at the time of experiment execution or your experiment design planning stage, you're using terms like, let's say you are working on Parkinson's disease, right? Targeting LRRK2 gene, right? So system has that capability to auto-label these things, right? This is your gene. This is the protein of interest. This is the strain you're working on. Or what is experiment if you think about it, right? It's a recipe, it's a set of instruction, eventually for machine to do the work for you. Currently, we don't have connected way to do that. So humans are involved doing pipetting and doing all the stuff. But ultimately, it's like writing set of rules like code to tell the machine what to do, right? That's what experiment documentation is. So we turn these unstructured notebook into a very structured data set with right label, right context, create knowledge graph out of it. Basically, it's stored in graph database, it's stored in vector database. So you are not just documenting it for auditing purpose or regulatory purpose. You are documenting this for more data science, to really create your data moat in the long term.
So is the idea there that, okay, so I run one experiment with one protocol, and then I run another experiment with a similar but not the exact same protocol, that I can then understand the relationships between those two separate experiments and understand like the areas of overlap, so that if as a data scientist, I go and I want experiments that look like this, I'm just able to grab all of those without having to do a lot of the data extraction myself. Am I thinking about that right?
Basically, yeah, you can derive those deviations from this model as well to say, this was a journey, this method had a baseline recipe, and then it followed this journey with these deviation at every point in the journey.
Yeah, I've heard that you offer templatized workflows as part of the Scispot platform as well. So can you share a little bit about what a templatized workflow means in the context of the Scispot platform and how that works from the user perspective?
So we have identified over 20 different types of bio companies in our sweet spot. We understand how their data model is structured, what type of experiments they run, what type of plates they use, what type of integrations they perform. We templatize all of that. When we onboard a customer, we don't spend months or days for implementation. Implementation happens on day one. People think it's just a marketing thing we use that you're ready to use on day one with custom-like platform. But because it has been templatized, learned from the past experience, we can set up all the data model, number one, all the databases, how they are connected with each other, all the integrations they need based on their workflow, that's more mass spec heavy or HPLC heavy or it's qPCR for diagnostic. When they bring the data, what type of transformation you have to do, what type of QC you have to do, what type of automation you have to do, is cell passaging workflow. Okay, you have to do the cell count, right? So flow cytometry. So we have that learning. So we already have templatized accounts for over 20 different types of bio company. That covers arguably 80% of companies in our market. Our goal is to go even further and try to cover 100% of the company. So there's no human involved helping you with implementation, taking 6 months. It's just very painful. I see many systems still take 6 months just to do the implementation.
How does the way that a biotech organization thinks about data or data science workflows change once they adopt the Scispot platform and the Scispot paradigm?
Yeah, that's a very good point, because most startups, when they are looking for a solution, they have very rigid workflows or very a specific need. But as they start scaling, their workflows evolve. They started as a, let's say, contract research organization, but now they have their own drug candidate, right? That will require slightly different version. The requirements will change. Or if their products enter late stage or biomanufacturing is happening, more GXP, rigid workflows are involved now, right? So these companies are evolving, but more traditional system miss the main point is that they create the hard-coded solution. It can never work, right? Your company is growing. It's like plastic brain, which is growing. And I think that's what we do differently, right? So it's moldable and it can grow with you. And that's very important. Most companies are plastic in nature.
UI and the user journey is also changing for these companies, as in with AI coming in picture, we'll see a lot of tools will have a hybridized, not just a UI interface or API first, but natural language embedded in between those two as well. Obviously, we're not there to have everything natural language, because I know Microsoft tried this with SharePoint, where they made the whole thing natural language based, and they got some good insights out of it, that some parts worked really well, some parts didn't work at all. So I don't think I'm on the extremes of either spectrum. I feel like there is a balance, but a lot of biotech companies are realizing that, hey, the user journey is also changing on how I think about this tooling, both from a wet lab and from a computational perspective.
Interesting. I think the question that comes to mind for me is, what is the vision for how a biotech organization is supposed to work 10 years from now that Scispot is putting forward? Because it's clear to me that you all have a different perspective on how the ecosystem is supposed to play and the role that Scispot plays in it, where as a third-party vendor, you're helping to create the boilerplate that all of these organizations are building on top of, so that they can focus on the areas that are their competitive advantage or the way that they're driving value individually. So could you just share a little bit about what that vision looks like?
Yeah. So biotech of the future is very externalized, right? So whether they're using robotics lab or they will be using more CROs, especially in early days, it doesn't make sense to even rent a pen space and run these experiments themselves. So we are seeing most companies are focusing, even on day one, in silico workflows. Then to validate some of their assumption, they are leveraging CROs. Cloud labs are still expensive, so we are not there yet, but I think it's going to happen sooner or later too. And wet lab portion is also diminishing compared to dry lab portion. So how we see the future is you need tools that support companies that are more externalized in nature. Some part is happening in-house. You cannot just focus on intra-lab connectivity. You have to focus on inter-lab connectivity because, okay, they are doing compound synthesis outside. Analysis is happening through CRO. But some of the experiments, assay binding work is happening in-house. You cannot have all the external work stored in spreadsheet, and then you do some of the internal work you're doing in your ELN, and you're collaborating with your partners through, I don't know, Google Suite, or sending them email or asking your CRO to upload things to S3 bucket. This makes your company really non-scalable. You raise enough money, then you create your own tech team, and they spend a couple of years to build their tech stack. We want to change that. We want to make sure on day one, you have this blueprint of your company. You choose what is your workflow, what is happening in-house through your own instrument or through your collaborative research, through external academic labs or CROs, CDMOs. You choose all of that. You get your standardized data model, easy way to exchange information, easy way to automate things. So that's the goal. We are moving in that direction. We are not 100% there yet.
I mean, it seems like that's that vision that you shared is the driver of why build an API first platform, right? Is that having that API first platform makes it easy, like creates structure for the way that things are automated internally, but it also creates that interface where things can happen externally as well as you start interfacing more with third-party CROs or CDMOs. Am I thinking about that?
Yeah, API first is a first step in the right direction. But then you have to think about you're connecting these two tools, what transformation you need to make sure the data is ingested in right format. Right, so that's very important. And what we do differently is, yes, it's API first, but if you're bringing data from qPCR, what do you have to do in between, right? So that middleware, the transformation happening in between, so it magically goes in the different system, and that data, as if that data belongs to that system, right? So how can you easily use multiple tools without really becoming too dependent on one system? I think that's the direction. That's what industry desperately needed.
Yeah, and doing things through an API, obviously in the data and the technology land, this is just the way that things are done. But in biotech, there's a lot of systems for which that sort of like API first paradigm is not necessarily there. So I'm curious how you all handle the sort of barriers and roadblocks that you might face in trying to integrate these biotech specific systems into this API first platform that you're creating and operating.
Yeah, I think when I was at hotels.com, we had this debate of like, software engineers think of everything as a product-centric approach. And then slowly data science and data engineering team also started thinking like software engineers. They used to think differently before that as they started building more and more tools and big data came in picture. I feel like bio is also going through that transition where you have computational folks who understand API first, API as a product, data as a product, versus wet lab people who are now also coming on board where they're using natural language to do some of these things. They don't need to necessarily learn how to code or learn how the technology works, but they're basically hitting an API in some shape or form. So they're realizing the importance of that. So their thinking is also changing into more on like how computational folks in bio thinks. So I feel like it's just a journey like where everybody's coming closer to the software thinking, and why it's beneficial because ultimately tools are software and they are in cloud, and everybody can benefit from it if they follow the same pattern or at least get closer to that pattern. So I'm seeing that transition, but you're right, it's still not pretty straightforward and easy because there's a change management depending on the type of company and how many legacy tools they've adopted in the past. Because if there's a legacy system they have to use, they've already invested in, it does become quite hard to like then bring an API layer where you might need to do something manually.
Yeah, so it strikes me that this way of working in the biotech space asks for your customers to be data competent and data native. So I'm curious, where do you see the gaps in like data capabilities at the companies that the customers that onboard with you, the customers that are exploring using Scispot as their platform of choice?
Yeah, so it depends on the persona, as we satisfy both wet lab and computational persona because we have a graphical user interface and the API toolset. I feel like the gap is reducing, but there's still a significant gap between the two, where wet lab optimizes for, hey, all I care about is in this UI, I should be able to like search and discover my data, plan experiments, execute experiments, and then be able to provide the results or some sort of feedback loop to computational folks, right? And then the priorities for computational folks are slightly different. They want to make sure that if a lot of plates are getting created, they can programmatically create those 96 well plates, connect with robots, connect with instruments. They don't want to like, most of them don't want to go through GUI, click, and then get to that state eventually. It's a very hard problem to solve because it requires a lot of development. That's why we front-loaded all these problems so we can scale faster in future, where we built a lot of this orchestration right from the beginning. But we still try and modularize both of those pieces depending on who we are onboarding. So let's say if you're onboarding a computational person, we always start with, okay, here's the API for Scispot system for lab sheets. So lab sheets are scientific databases. On you go, right? The onboarding entry point is from there. But if you're onboarding like a wet lab scientist, somebody who really is passionate about graphical user interface, the onboarding and the user journey is slightly different. And I think that would continue to evolve as well as we get more smarter in terms of natural language. I feel like we might bridge the gap, but there's always going to be like some differentiation between the two. Are you seeing something similar like in those two persona, or what are your thoughts?
I see an entire spectrum that varies according to the roles that exist in these different biotech organizations. I agree that the wet lab scientist tends to be focused mostly on just how can I accomplish my workflow, because most of their mental capacity is spent in driving the biological insight they're trying to drive. They're not really concerned about the entire ecosystem or the system as a whole that might make use of that insight. But then you have the IT team that's mostly concerned about integrating the software that you're onboarding into the broader ecosystem and making sure that it meets sort of the security and compliance specifications. And then obviously you have the computational team who's, as you discussed, trying to do this scalable analysis and just make sure that all of the metadata is in a state where it's AI ready, to the point that Guru made. And then at the business leader level, it's like all of this, I just want my summary operational level metrics for how our business is running and what kind of resources we're consuming and like how close we are to accomplishing our next milestone as an organization. And so I think building a platform that serves all of those personas and solves all of those problems is really hard, which is why there are multiple people in the space with different visions for how that plays out. But I find your vision of serving as the middleware between all of these systems, but also creating these workflows and processes behind the scenes that bootstrap these companies to drive insights, to do AI faster, to be like an interesting paradigm of how that goes. I want to look toward the future of the companies that are building on Scispot for a second and just understand, can you give some examples of where you think companies that adopt Scispot are going to be able to achieve success in ML or AI moving forward in ways that they wouldn't be enabled to achieve that if they weren't using Scispot in the first place?
I'm saying it's more real-time feedback, established feedback, like feedback in loop. Every test you run in let's say you're a molecular diagnostic company, right? Every sample you process, every test you run, your company should become smarter. Otherwise, you are just a testing company, right? You will always be valued based on, 10x of multiple based on which market we are talking about, right? But companies' value should be like 1000x if they really have their digital brain. So how we make companies different is they have instant feedback loop. So every time they run an experiment, every time they run a test, company becomes smarter. And I think that's the goal here.
Is the idea that, for just the example of an experimentally driven company, that Scispot is going to be recommending the next experiment that you need to run, or the next set of experiments that you need to run in order to drive the next insights?
That's very short term. We are almost there. As I said, proactive AI assistance, we are almost there. We are running some tests for that. But I'm thinking even more than that, right? So you have this intelligent brain, which is growing every time you're running experiment, and connected with your own proprietary models, your own AI models, right? So you have this feedback loop in place. But yes, guiding them, designing right experiment, figuring out the next steps, or placing order of right antibodies, I think these things are already almost there as we are learning and improving the process. But the goal here is how can we help companies build their own proprietary model connected with their data? And 100% of the data is AI compatible. Most of the data currently, I cannot even touch it, right? So that's the problem here.
Interesting. Satya, any thoughts on that?
This reminds me of what NVIDIA CEO mentioned like a few months ago when he talked about like how AI will touch biology and how biology has so many variables. And that's where the LLMs would have the biggest impact, where companies would be able to build their own kind of smaller foundational models, not necessarily large language models, but smaller models that are specific to their digital brain that Guru talked about earlier. My North Star or my long-term vision is as companies use Scispot, they can build that proprietary database that belongs to them, and that becomes like their mode to grow the company as well. So as they learn and have the feedback loop from their experiments, from their samples, from their inventory, from the dry and wet lab connection, can they form their own graph database, whether that's in Snowflake, Databricks, or Scispot, agnostic to where it lives eventually, but having that graph database that they can say, hey, this is actually, I can turn this into a smaller model than a large language model, but this is like my company's LLM. And this is my moat as well for longer term sustainability of the company.
As we draw to a close, are there any parting thoughts that you would leave our audience with? What are the situations in which you think that people should come and check you out, and how can they do that?
My number one recommendation will be, if you are starting a bio company, think about it. It's a data company. So you need to think about, okay, you're thinking about running first set of experiment, creating prototype, but your company will be bought not because of your asset. The company is going to be bought because you have some proprietary models, a proprietary data set. And if that's the focus, consider reaching out to us. We're happy to share insights we gathered. You can directly go to Scispot website, scispot.com/demo. You can book a demo. If you want me and Satya to join the call, just add a note. We love speaking with more companies too. Otherwise, someone from our team will show up and help you prepare your data infrastructure.
And I think my push would be not thinking of what you need from as an ELN or LIMS or STMS, because a lot of companies I've noticed, they start with, hey, I need a lab information management system, or I need an electronic lab notebook. I would rather flip that question of, I like how Amazon think about this. What are the outcomes? And then work backwards from there. And they might want to start with LIMS. That's great. But what are the outcomes that LIMS can help them drive? And I feel like a lot of that is sometimes missing. Not always. I think a lot of modern bio companies are realizing, hey, my outcome is I should be able to have this data model that I can share with my computational team, right? Now let's work backwards of what tools can help me do it. And maybe some ELN might do half of it or 80% of it. So I feel like starting from that and then working backwards would be great, because traditionally in the last decade, companies have built this premeditated buckets of ELN, LIMS, STMS, and I feel like we should break away from it. But those are like industry terms, so everybody uses them, which kind of makes sense as a common language. But I feel like it's a good time to maybe do a paradigm shift from those three terms.
Guru and Satya, it's been a pleasure to talk with you and learn more about Scispot. Really appreciate the time and look forward to connecting down the line.
And that's it for this episode of Data in Biotech. If you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe, rate, or leave a review in your podcast platform of choice. See you next time.